welcome to the Women in Journalism lowdown on the lobby. I am going to interview Carole Walker about her excellent book, Lobby Life, about the history of what she describes as Westminster's secret society. But we thought it would be a good opportunity to talk through the issues that are very current at the moment. We've all been hearing a great deal about lobbying. I'm sure all of you here will know the difference between a lobby correspondent and a lobbyist, but there are an awful lot of people out there in the world who don't know the difference. And it often also, there is a confusion between the lobby, the noun, the vaulted ceilings thereof of some of the more imposing areas of the Palace of Westminster, and the group of scribes who go around as lobby correspondents. Now, could I ask you to mute yourselves? Carole, or indeed I would as well, would be happy to answer questions towards the end of the hour-long session. But I'm going to start by introducing Carole, who was a lobby correspondent for the BBC, as you will all know, for over 20 years, I think. Now presents a weekly programme on Times Radio, Monday to Thursday, every night from 10 o'clock. Very excellent programme it is too. And has still found time to write Lobby Life. Carole, it goes most interestingly into the history of the lobby. Why did governments feel that they had to have an organisation for parliamentary journalists?
Julia, thank you for that. And just to say, it's great to be here and talking to you. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to Women in Journalism. Well, the history of the lobby goes back to the 1880s, very early in the 1880s. It's hard to imagine now when we look at Parliament and we see all the huge security measures all the way around Westminster, that back in the 19th century, anybody could wander into Parliament, and people discovered this, and they would just wander in and harangue their MPs about whatever issue that they were concerned about. And so the Speaker of the time, Speaker Denison, decided that there'd have to be restrictions on who was going to be allowed in particular into the members' lobby, so that members of Parliament could at least get in and cast their votes without being stopped on the way by various of their constituents asking them questions. And so they introduced restrictions, but the MPs right from the outset realized that the journalists were people they wanted to be able to talk to. So a list of journalists, a very small list, was drawn up. There was then a new speaker who decided that, well, he didn't want these pesky journalists getting in the way, and this should be just for members of Parliament. But there was such an outcry about this in the newspapers of the day that the parliamentary authorities relented, and a lobby list was drawn up. And this was a list of journalists who were allowed to go into the members' lobby, which, as Julia knows very well, is this cavernous Gothic chamber right outside the Chamber of Houses of Parliament. And the lobby list was the start, really, of what we know as the lobby. It is a club of Westminster journalists who've got the right to go there into Parliament and to talk to MPs, so long as, of course, they want to stop and talk to them. And that is the beginning of the lobby itself and the rights that lobby journalists have.
I joined the lobby, astonishingly, nearly 50 years ago, and I'm still a member. I joined in 1974 for Labour Weekly. In those days, I mean, I was looked on pretty askance because I worked for the Labour Party anyway. I mean, for a low-life organisation such as the Labour Party, which was, what I mean is, was regarded by the people practically had wing collars 50 years ago. And one had the impression, one was given the impression all the time, this is how we do business. It was a terribly stuffy organisation. I know it's changed now and we're going to come on to that, but why was it so stuffy, do you think? Was it just because of the way politics was done?
Well, I think it had a long history of being something of a gentleman's club. And yes, it was a gentleman's club. Julia, of course, you were one of the early female pioneers in there. And essentially, I mean, when you look back over history for so many decades, it was men that were running the show. And it was also very secretive. For many, many years, none of the regular sessions for briefing lobby journalists, no one was allowed to talk about them. I remember the great Chris Moncrief, who Julia, I'm sure, will remember, who was the chief political correspondent of the Press Association and an absolute legend of the lobby. And he said that when he joined, it was like MI5. And he was told that he wasn't even allowed to talk to his wife about the fact that he may have been to a briefing from number 10 Downing Street. And I think part of the secrecy was because for many, many years and many decades, it suited both sides. The government of the day could, and politicians of the day, could brief lobby journalists. They could do it on what was known as lobby terms, which just means that you can use the quotes, but you can't identify the person that's saying it to you. And so the politicians could get their message across. And of course, for the journalists, it gave them a fantastic inside track. And there was so much secrecy about it that an awful lot of the news organizations didn't even really realize how their correspondents at Westminster were able to find out, oh, he seems to me incredibly well informed about what the government of the day is thinking and planning to do. And so it suited both sides to have this very secretive, closed society where each of them were in a privileged position and each of them could use it to their own advantage. Of course, we're going back in the years long before social media and when there weren't even very many newspapers, let alone 24-hour news and so on. So I think that's the origins of the lobby. And I think perhaps that explains a little bit about why, as you say, it still felt like an organization with gentlemen in winged collars and, you know, they would all go off and have a quiet gentleman's drink together and so on. And it took a long time for that to change.
Now, one thing that comes out very clearly in your book is that throughout the 20th century, and indeed the years of the 21st century so far, the government, successive governments have tried to close down the lobby or tried to end the relationship that exists there. This is still going on today. In fact, we saw it quite recently with Dominic Cummings' attempts. Why is that? Is that because the press is doing a good job?
Well, I think it is because the collective group of some of the best and most hardworking and brilliant political journalists in the land is a pretty powerful thing collectively. And yes, you're right, successive governments have tried to sidestep it, to control it, to strip it of its powers, and in some cases to get rid of it altogether. But successive governments have essentially failed to do so because they still need to find a way of explaining to the wider public, to the voters, what they're up to and trying to get their message across. Of course, the journalists themselves have a completely different agenda. They're there to find out all the things that the government doesn't want them to find out about, and to explain the wider context and to explain the difficulties with what the government is trying to do. But if you didn't have the lobby, yes, a government could put out a press release, put out a statement, and of course now these days MPs and ministers do communicate directly on Twitter and so on. But for every statement and every comment they put out, there'll be a whole series of questions. And if they don't get the lobby journalists together collectively to talk to them, then somebody in number 10 Downing Street is going to have to make literally hundreds of phone calls every hour of every day and you'd have an even bigger number of press officers in Whitehall than you do at the moment.
It's been my experience over the years that people who, particularly in newspaper offices and sometimes editors, rather resent the lobby or believe that lobby journalists just listen to what they're told and write it down and put it in their newspapers without bothering to put it through the strain it through their intelligence as to whether they are being sold a pup or a story that the government wants placed. That is the case, isn't it? I mean, that people assume that it is just to feed journalists, whereas in fact, of course, any self-respecting journalist examines what they're being told and asks why the government is putting out a line in the manner that it is.
Well, absolutely. It is the most common and frequent criticism of the lobby, that it's just a way of the government spoon-feeding lazy journalists who'll whack it out in their newspapers and they don't have to bother to do anything else. I mean, I think there are several answers to that. The first is that no self-respecting journalist could ever put out a story that was simply, well, this is what the government has said. There is so much complexity to our politics, to our political life, to the policies that are unveiled, to the way that they work, to the dynamics that go on across the country, that any journalist who did that, frankly, wouldn't last 5 minutes. I think the other thing is that one of the most fascinating things during my work on this book was in talking to some of the many representatives of successive governments who have briefed the lobby, who have been there as the spokesman or very occasionally woman for the Prime Minister. And I should have explained for people who haven't read the book, one of the great treats of being a lobby journalist is that twice a day when Parliament is sitting, you get a briefing from the Prime Minister's spokesman or woman, spokesperson, when they will run through the issues of the day and then face an absolute barrage of questions from journalists, an onslaught of questions. And one of the real privileges and the fascinating insights I got while I was writing this book was to talk to some of those people who have faced the media and who I faced very often when I was a political journalist myself. And let me tell you, if you talk to any of them, the idea that they were simply able to dole out the lines of the day, it is frankly laughable. Even some of the incredibly tough people who fulfilled that role, people like Alistair Campbell, like Sir Christopher Mayer, now went on to be an esteemed British ambassador to the United States, will tell you it is a really daunting experience, and that the collective power of the lobby journalists, of the political editors and bright new up-and-coming political hacks from newspapers, from broadcasts and from websites these days, can be a pretty formidable force in their own right. And you know, their task in those briefings is to try and get the spokesman or woman to let slip something that they didn't want to let slip. And of course that does happen, and then that gives them a story. And you know, famously, Sir Bernard Ingham, who I was very, very grateful to, and he gave me a lot of his time in talking through what it was like for him when he was briefing on behalf of Margaret Thatcher, and he talked about how he felt that he was the prey, and they were the pack hunting after him in full cry. And of course, every now and then he'd let slip those comments about what the Prime Minister really thought about some of her ministers. And John Biffin, the famously semi-detached member of the cabinet, that would give the lobby journalists the story that they wanted. So I think if you look back over the history of how it works, if you listen and read what it was like from the perspective of those who were trying to contain the lobby pack, I think that argument that it is a lazy journalism where journalists just print what they're told. It just simply is no longer the case. Perhaps it was 100 years or so ago, certainly before your days at Westminster, Julia, but I just don't think that could possibly be the case anymore.
I was very struck in particular by Gus ODonnell, God no less, as he became known, saying to you in the book that of all the jobs he's done, and of course he went on to become cabinet secretary, that actually being the Prime Minister's press spokesman was the most difficult he'd ever done. And he was tearing what remaining hair he had out on a daily basis. Mind you, he was John Major's press secretary, so
not an easy job.
He had a lot of issues to deal with at the time. We should perhaps raise a hello here. I'm not sure if Bernard Ingham is with us, but he was hoping to come to the meeting today. I was going to refer to Joe Haynes, who was a journalist turned gamekeeper, who actually tried to end the system altogether by refusing to meet the press, which was quite remarkable, was it not? And then if you could take us from Joe Haynes to Dominic Cummings actually trying to end the relationship in the modern day.
Yes, certainly. Well, Joe Haynes, again, another of those another former spokesman, as he was, for Harold Wilson, on and off throughout the 1970s, was extraordinarily, he was a lobby journalist and he absolutely hated the lobby. I think from his first moment there, when he was ticked off for wearing suede shoes and told that if he ever dared to wear them again, he'd be banned from the parliamentary estate, he took a pretty dim view of the lobby and the way that it worked. And of course, Wilson, particularly during his later periods in power, had a very difficult time with the press. Wilson was somebody who, when he first became Prime Minister, was an absolute darling of the media, and he knew how to play the media, and they loved him, and it was a terrific relationship. But as so often happens, after many years in power, it became very difficult. And when the questions turned to the role of his hugely powerful advisor, Marcia Falkender, and various scandals that she had been involved in, and the press were besieging Marcia's house in the way that they do when these big stories break, Joe Haynes became so angry with the behavior of the media and of the lobby in particular, that yes, he actually ended lobby briefings completely and said he would simply put out a statement. It's interesting that when Wilson lost power and Heath came to power, the first thing that Heath did was to invite in the chairman of the lobby and say, right, we're going to reinstate these briefings, because he felt that Heath really wanted to develop his relationship through the media and to get his message out to the wider public. But yeah, there have been successive attempts, as I say, to sidestep, to get round or to get rid of the lobby. But it happened very recently when Boris Johnson, who of course is a political journalist himself through to his fingertips, but when he won his big majority in the December of 2019, of course he'd been Prime Minister before that, but once he was there in Downing Street with that lovely 80-seat majority, which I think strengthened his grip, as he saw it, on power. And the key figures around him, and when it came to communicating with the media, were Dominic Cummings, who I'm sure needs no introduction, and Lee Kane, who was the Director of Communications, who had also been a key figure in the Vote Leave campaign during the Brexit referendum. And they made no secret of the fact that they had utmost disdain for the lobby. They thought it was an outdated institution, that it was part of that establishment that was working against Boris Johnson, that was not in tune with the people, and they wanted to take back control. And Dominic Cummings even signalled it. Some people may remember that there was a big fuss about a blog that Dominic Cummings wrote in early 2020, when he said he wanted to bring in various misfits and people with a different outlook on life. And he actually said in that blog, the trouble is also that people think of communications as almost synonymous with the lobby. Well, we're going to do things differently. And they'd already had a huge rows with various bits of the media during the 2019 election campaign. Boris Johnson had refused to appear on the Today programme, on Channel 4, on Newsnight, on various others. By early 2020, ministers were still boycotting the Today programme. And essentially, that close team of advisors from the Vote Leave era looked back at what they'd done during that Brexit campaign, where they'd been able to target their messaging very effectively through direct messages on social media, targeting the groups of voters that they wanted to get their message through. And what it allowed them to do was, yes, to put their message through in an unfiltered way, without having the prism of these pesky political journalists who explain the wider context and the wider difficulties with what was being proposed. So essentially, they set out to do that. And they carried on the war with the media long after the election campaign. As you know, Julia, often relations between medias and political parties get very strained during the heat of an election campaign. Usually those things are then quietly soothed over a drink or two once the government is established. But the team around Boris Johnson wanted to carry that on. And so you saw boycotts continuing. You saw briefings that were only, to which only a very small group of political journalists would be invited. That is something which previous prime ministers have done before. And again, it never really seems to work as the government of the day hopes. And it got to this point where there was word got out about a briefing that only a very narrow group of journalists had been invited to, from Lord Frost, David Frost, who was at the time still negotiator before he was actually made a minister. And when various journalists turned up who hadn't been invited, those who were invited were in the lobby of Downing Street, divided from those who weren't invited, and those who weren't invited were sent home, which prompted a mass walkout. The lobby collectively walked out en masse. And it's interesting that despite all the huge competition that there is between all the journalists at Westminster on this, they decided, look, this is enough. We're not going to be treated by this. And all of this was coming to a head at around the time that the COVID pandemic emerged, and emerged as a very, very serious threat. And essentially, the government realized that it had to be able to communicate more widely. It had to have a working relationship with the media if it was going to explain to the wider public the extraordinary restrictions that it was going to put on their lives. And I'm sure everyone will remember back to the spring of 2020 and the early lockdowns and the extraordinary changes that brought upon our lives. And the government realized that it simply had to back down somewhat. So, I mean, things didn't end there, but that was the point, I think, where they backed away from trying to completely scupper the lobby.
No, at that time, we were told that the government was going to move to have West Wing style White House briefings. We all looked on with great interest and anticipation. And Allegra Stratton, as we remember, was lined up to be the CJ Craig, and it was all this extremely expensive room was decorated, or one of the many expensive rooms that has been redecorated in Downing Street in recent years, in order for these briefings to take place there. That, I believe, was part of the plan to do away with the lobby. Why do you think they pulled away from that? Because they realized that they were not going to be able to control the press in the way that they would by having online, I don't mean online, I mean real-time briefings?
Yeah, it's a fascinating saga, and I think they were pulled for a couple of reasons. It's back in the summer of 2020 that it was first revealed that the government was planning these White House style briefings where the spokeswoman, as she was appointed, Allegra Stratton, was going to brief the media directly instead of having these off-camera lobby briefings, which have gone on for so many decades. The government looked at the experience of the daily news conferences during the pandemic when ministers or the Prime Minister and the most senior scientific advisors would be able to communicate directly. And they thought, great, well, this is working really well. We can do this with the lobby more widely when it comes to our politics, and it will enable us to communicate directly, because that was what it's all about. And I think they also thought, and people will see these really annoying and rather stupid questions that these political journalists ask, and how they don't simply accept what they're told. And it will all work in our favor. So Lee Cain and Dominic Cummings both thought this was a brilliant idea and persuaded the Prime Minister it was a brilliant idea. And he personally persuaded Allegra Stratton to take on the role. And I think several things happened. First of all, the arrival of Allegra Stratton prompted an almighty internal battle within Downing Street, which was essentially a battle for who was going to have the Prime Minister's ear. Dominic Cummings had already got in trouble for his Barnard Castle trip, but it sparked an almighty internal briefing war. Lee Cain wasn't happy with the choice of Allegra Stratton to do the job. He thought somebody else should do it. She had made it clear that she'd only do it rightly if she had proper access to the Prime Minister, because unless you're there and actually able to talk to him, you can't really brief properly on any one of dozens of different issues without having a proper understanding and insight into what is going on. And it provoked this power struggle. And as part of the power struggle, there was a lot of briefing against Carrie Simons, as she was at the time, the Prime Minister's now wife. This led to those very high-profile departures of Lee Cain and Dominic Cummings, which people will remember in the autumn of last year. And I think at that time, there was also, the Prime Minister was facing huge amounts of media pressure over a whole series of private texts he'd made, over a previous relationship with Jennifer Arcuri, over who'd paid for the Downing Street refurb. And those that were brought in to replace Cummings and Cain looked at this and could just see how a televised news briefing would be absolutely dominated with these rather uncomfortable questions about the Prime Minister's private life. And it would mean that stories which at the moment made page 8 of the Mirror would be there and included in all the rolling news programs, on the television bulletins, that there would be clips that would perpetuate these stories, and that stories that might have quietly died a death would be given their own momentum day by day. And I think they realized that it was a perilous tightrope, and that sooner or later, even as an experienced and brilliant a journalist as Allegra Stratton was going to fall off this tightrope, and it would be a huge problem for the government. So yeah, having built this £2.8 million studio in Downing Street, they decided that, well, yeah, they're not going to go ahead with it after all. And they said, oh, well, of course, you know, the studio is now a great backdrop for the occasional news conferences that we do have. So of course we haven't wasted any money. But it was, they thought it was a great idea until they realized that it was a terrible idea. And it's interesting, if you talk to political journalists, there's a huge divide. Some thought it would have been fantastic, including an awful lot of broadcast journalists. And others thought it would be a nightmare because they'd still have to go behind the scenes and get the off the record briefings where they found out what they really wanted to know.
We should acknowledge, of course, as all lobby correspondents know, that whether lobby briefings take place or not, there are always individual conversations going on somewhere behind the arras. And I have to say that at one point in my active life at Westminster, there was a sort of sub lobby that I don't think you knew about, Bernard, if you're here. And a group of us used to meet with various ministers privately, and we just didn't let on about it, but we all trusted each other not to, about half a dozen of us. And we met with very senior ministers, and we did actually find out things that Downing Street didn't want us to know, because of course, while Downing Street is in the right hands, the press secretary is almost invariably honest, they still don't tell you things that they don't want you to know. And you have to, if you want to find out what is really going on, you have to go to a number of different sources, which is all part of the jigsaw of being a lobby correspondent, which makes it so much fun.
I would just say on that, yes, of course, it's absolutely crucial to point out that lobby journalists don't just go to the Downing Street briefing. They spend a huge amount of their time talking. I mean, the great thing is they've got this access to various parts of Parliament where members of the public can't go, and they can accost members of all parties and ministers at any time. And of course, they will also be doing the wining, the dining, the lunches, the coffees, the chats, getting to know people, talking to ministers, getting to know some of the different dynamics that there are going on at Westminster. And that is what I should have perhaps accentuated this point when we were talking earlier about whether lobby journalists are simply spoon-fed lines from Downing Street. They will be talking to all their other contacts, the advisors around ministers, the opposition parties, the rebels on the back benches. And if you think back to the time of Theresa May's time in power, when she had almost no majority to speak of and huge numbers of people fighting her on all fronts as she tried to get her Brexit deal, all those other dynamics were as important or even more so than what the government was trying to do. So yes, there are those individual meetings, and then there are little groups of journalists who will perhaps take a minister out for lunch together so that they can all get to know one another, and various functions, drinks, and so on. All of this goes to build up the contacts book and the understanding which lobby journalists have of the way the political world is working.
And being able to ring people at midnight, which is
yes,
give you if you've bought them lunch sometime in the last 5 years, and also if you remember the name of their partner, which is Langdon's second rule of lobby journalism was always remember the name of the partner, because it's the partner who's going to answer the phone first. But I'm talking, of course, before new technology. Now that has changed because you can get through to the person directly on their mobile, and that has made a huge difference, hasn't it, in access to politicians. You don't through the civil service. You don't have to worry about the private office, and nobody knows who they've been talking to.
Mobile phones, absolutely, the essential tool of the trade, and having the personal mobile numbers of some of the key figures are absolutely essential, because it is all about having those contacts, having those people that you can ring when a story breaks. And in my more than 20 years at the BBC, frequently either early in the morning or late at night, needing to try to get hold of somebody to find out if a story was true, if it was half true, if it was going to really happen immediately, if everyone in the cabinet was happy about it. All of those different elements to a story are absolutely crucial. And I think in a way, that's why, even when we've got social media and people can look at the direct statements put out by their member of parliament or the Secretary of State for Health or whatever, the political journalists have adapted. And so most people who are just interested in politics and want to know what's going on can't possibly spend all of their time trying to stay across every single person's Twitter feed and every single nuance coming from different wings of different political parties. And that is what our political journalists, our lobby members, that's what they do. They try to make sure that they are across all aspects, reading the briefing papers, not accepting the top line of the press release, but reading the select committee reports. There is a huge amount involved in those stories, which then get distilled down, hopefully, to something that the wider public can understand.
Now, we must allow some time in a bit for questions, if people would like to ask questions. But one issue we haven't spoken of yet is we have a very interesting chapter in Lobby Life about scandals and sexism. And while the lobby has modernized hugely in recent years, and you put in the book the new lobby rules, which are so much more to do with the present, the way the world works, as the previous book of rules, which was called Lobby Practice, which included things like, you know, never run after a minister, and don't be seen to take a note. I mean, such scandalous things as to have a pen and person. There are now a lot of women lobby correspondents, which is great, but still not enough, are there? And the diversity issue has not been properly addressed either.
No, I think certainly things have changed, and they've changed quite radically. And you know, Julia, you were an absolute pioneer in this, the first female political editor at Westminster, and there when I think it was much tougher than it was when I joined the lobby. I mean, even in the 1980s, there were only 7 women lobby journalists, and when I joined in the mid-1990s, I still very often found that I was the only woman in the room. It did feel like a very male-dominated place. I have to say that I never personally faced any abuse, intimidation, or any of the appalling circumstances that I know some people have gone through. And when I was writing the book and researching the book, I was actually quite surprised that even some of our most senior and forthright political journalists, people like Beth Rigby at Sky and Pippa Crerar at The Mirror, both of them now political editors, talked about how daunting it was. And Beth Rigby talked to me about how the senior men in the lobby would all sort of form a little private gaggle, and she never felt part of it, and she felt excluded. And I think that, I mean, your reflections on this, Julia, will be fascinating. I had worked as a journalist for quite some time before I came to Westminster. I'd worked overseas, I'd covered foreign stories, I'd covered wars and conflict, and I'd worked with all male teams. And I'd worked in countries where women were treated with a lot less regard than they are in the UK. So I think it didn't really strike me. I think I was struck more by some senior politicians who were incredibly patronizing rather than actually finding it a threatening atmosphere. But of course, a number of women have gone through some very difficult experiences.
They have indeed. And I in no way diminish those experiences, although I didn't have a problem with people behaving improperly at all. My main problem, which oddly enough remains even unto this day, was that I was number 2 on the Guardian when I was first in the lobby. Well, when I was in the lobby in the 1970s, and Eleanor Goodman, my friend and colleague, was number 2 on the Financial Times. And although we don't look anything like each other, because we were both women in a similar job, we were mistaken for each other at the time. And people would come up and say, here's that letter I was telling you about. And you'd say, sorry. And it would have been a letter they had been discussing with Eleanor. Now, last night, at a book launch of the new book, UK Presidents, which Ian Dale has edited and which I'm proud to say I've written a chapter, Sue Cameron, who is here, and I were talking to Lionel Barber of the FT, and he said to me, I haven't seen you since the Turin European Summit in 1996. And Sue very politely said, what a great memory you've got. And I didn't like to say, actually, I've never been to Turin. I rang Eleanor this evening and I said, did you go to the Turin European Summit in 1996 and see Lionel Barber there? And she said, yes. So it was her. Last night, I was once again mistaken for, well, I mean, he knew it was me, but nevertheless, we are interchangeable. We're just women, you know?
Well, I will just say, Julia, that you're in good company because Theresa May, of course, you know, the number of women in Parliament has also changed and that has helped. But Theresa May, in her early years in Parliament, described how she was sometimes mistaken for Theresa Gorman. Now, Theresa May and Theresa Gorman do not look remotely alike. Theresa Gorman was one of the original Maastricht rebels, and Theresa May said that she was frequently mistaken for Theresa Gorman to the extent that she actually had a badge made which read, I'm the other Theresa. So you are in good company, Julia.
I think while we're talking about the sexism subject, though, I would like to amuse our audience by reminding them that that in your chapter you head all your chapters with a pertinent quote, and the chapter on scandals and sexism is headed with a quotation from the current Prime Minister, and it is a quote in which he is giving advice in 2006 or thereabouts to his successor as editor of The Spectator on how to deal with the magazine publisher. Now, this lady was Kimberly Quinn, as she was known at the time. She's now Kimberly Fortier, and she came to considerable fame and attention for her relationship with the secretary. However, so this is Boris Johnson's advice to his successor. Quotes, just pat her on the bottom and send her on her way, he said. Well, that has a ring of the current Johnson issues, does it not? I thought that was very, very fine, a very fine quote.
Yeah, well, because we should remind anyone who's missed it that, of course, Caroline Noakes, Conservative MP, who's chair of the Women and Equalities Committee of the Houses of Parliament, just mentioned casually during a conversation on Sky News a few days ago that the Prime Minister's father, Stanley Johnson, had smacked her on the bottom. She said she remembered it was at the party conference in Blackpool in 2003, and he smacked me on the backside as hard as he could and said, "Oh, Romsey, you've got a lovely seat." I mean, she is the MP for Romsey. But that is back in 2005. I should say, I think that the behavior of men has changed. And there was that Me Too moment in Westminster when, if you remember, there was a whole wave of revelations about the past behaviors of some very senior MPs and ministers. And indeed, there was the whole row about Michael Fallon, who was the Defence Secretary. He had to resign at the time. And it emerged that some 15 years earlier, he had been out for lunch with a female journalist. And on their way back into the Parliament, he had lunged at her and pinned her against the wall. So that actually opened the floodgates to a whole series of allegations. A number of ministers left their post or issued grovelling apologies. And I think that it did cause a lot of members of parliament to think quite hard about the way they had behaved in the past, and quite right too. As I say, I'm not somebody who ever suffered any abuse or intimidation, but yes, in my early years at Westminster, if you were particularly at something like a party conference late at night, there were a lot of men who would put their hands where they shouldn't be putting their hands, just get a little bit too close, just a little bit too intimate. And that sort of behavior, firstly, I simply, I would whack the hand away and tell them where to put it. But I now look back and think, well, maybe I should have made more of a fuss about it at the time, because maybe if people like me had addressed some of the smaller incidences of misbehavior, men wouldn't have thought they could get away with it for so long.
I'm going to butt in now and say thank you both so much. This has been absolutely fascinating, both from a kind of historical perspective of how the lobby started and it's changed and why. But we've got some great questions in the chat. So if I can put one to you that kind of leads on a little bit from what you've just said, Carole. This is from Lauren, and she says, where do you think the line should be drawn in terms of Westminster journalists befriending politicians as they need to for stories, but do you think they should try and keep some distance for impartiality purposes?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question. And I know that some of my former colleagues at the BBC, for example, decided a few years back that they would stop taking MPs out for lunch because they felt that it put them in a difficult position if they were then going to perhaps write or broadcast a story that put them in a difficult light. I think in my experience, the answer I would give is that both sides, when you go out for a lunch or have a conversation, especially these days, are very well aware of the rules of the game. They know that I am a political journalist, they are the politician, and that ultimately my job is to write and tell stories in the way that I think is the most accurate and fair way possible. And they are, a politician, and their role is perhaps to try and explain their behavior, or perhaps to try to convince me that a policy they're pushing or a campaign that they're pushing is a particularly important one, or perhaps to make me try and think about the mistakes that the government is making. So I would say that, yes, I can understand those risks. I don't think I've ever got to know politicians so well that, for example, I go on holiday with them. But yeah, I would have a lunch or a drink, and you will talk about not just stories, but perhaps, your family, your background, your experiences, your wider interests, and so on. For me, I think that it's just important always to know where those boundaries are. And Julia might want to come in on this, but I would always, for example, if somebody told me something at a lunch and I was then going to broadcast it, I would always either at the time or subsequently say, look, I was really interested in that line when you described this man as in very derogatory terms. Are you happy for me to use it? And so on, and clarify those rules of the game. And that's the way I always approached it.
But it's like you have to build relationships, but there are kind of ground rules for doing that. I think that's really interesting. There's another question here from Daniel Horden. And I think what this relates to is what it's like for really young journalists going into the lobby when they're there for the first time and they don't have those contacts, they don't know how to make those relationships. Was it daunting? Was it a daunting experience when you first entered the lobby, trying to develop relationships with politicians, advisors, and understand how things worked? Any advice there for the younger journalists who are coming up behind you?
I think the short answer was yes. I mean, you'd wander into the Houses of Parliament. On the first few forays, I'd go with a colleague who could show me, where to go, where to find your way around this rabbit warren, which is the Palace of Westminster, how to even find this obscure tiny briefing room up the top of a turret where the afternoon briefing from the Prime Minister's press secretary would be held, and to introduce yourself to people. And yes, it was daunting, and you didn't sort of understand the rules. I wandered into the House of Commons library and because I was told it was a good way of checking things, and the clerk looked at me in absolute horror and sort of said, "Which is your constituency?" And I said, no, I'm a BBC political correspondent. And he said, "I'm very sorry, you're not allowed." I was promptly marched out, and I felt humiliated. Of course, you can now get all the House of the Commons library material online. It's much easier. But I would literally hang around in the members' lobby and go and introduce myself to people, and I'd wander up to people that I knew and that I could recognize and say, "Hello, my name is Carole Walker, and I was just interested in your view on so and so." And most of them were friendly and polite. I did. There's a very senior MP who's been in the Houses of Parliament for a very long time, and he's still there. And I remember him saying, "Ooh, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" And I said, "Well, I'm here waiting for tonight's vote because I'm a political correspondent for the BBC." So there were comments like that. And yes, sometimes you do have to take a bit of a deep breath. And yes, it does take a while to find your way around physically and professionally, and know where to find things and who to talk to and who to introduce yourself to. And I did find it daunting initially, but I'd been in other daunting experiences in my professional life, and I felt I just simply had to get on with it.
I think that's really great advice, because I think what you're saying there is, be curious about people, ask them questions, look as if you are interested in them, and they're much more likely to respond to you. We've got Julia. Can I just ask one more really good question from Daniel? Just as you've mentioned the competition between Westminster journos, how does that lobby relationship work between journos? Is it one of competition or of supporting each other?
It's a very good question, and it's a bit of both. Journalists are hugely competitive, and they have to be in our current media landscape. They always want to be the one that's got the scoop on the front page, the one that gets the story before any of the other political journalists. But there is also, and I'm sure Julia will agree with this, a tremendous camaraderie amongst journalists. There's a tremendous understanding of how it all works. And what I would say is that if you're in a collective briefing with a lot of other political journalists, that can be a strength, because what will happen is you might ask a question and you'll be lucky if you get a follow-up, but then someone else will follow it up with a similar but slightly different point, and somebody else can follow up on that. And so that can collectively try to extract bits of information from someone. But any political journalist who has got a scoop, who has got a story to themselves, is definitely not going to share it with their rivals. They will want to be in a position that they can put it out on the front page. I would say that there are sometimes riders to that. Sometimes you might find out about a story or get a whiff of a story and be uncertain quite how far to go on it. And, there are occasions, and I would be interested to know whether Julia has done this, when journalists will decide to work together to share it, because then they can both go to their editors and say, "Look, I know this sounds like a pretty shocking story, but we've both got this, and let me tell you it's true," because sometimes you'll find that editors are more timid than the journalists about the stories that they actually want to print or broadcast.
Yes, I agree entirely. And I'd also like to agree with you about the camaraderie. People are very kind, actually, when you're new, and I am puzzled by why how difficult it must be to be a new political journalist today. But people are very kind. The most important thing, though, to do is to put the time in. You have to put the time in. You have to work really hard, and that is very difficult on your private life. And when I was a very young journalist, I'm in the house sat all evening, and the only friends I had were people who worked at Westminster, because you didn't have any other life because you got home after midnight. So, but it is putting the time in, I think, is the most important thing. But one is bucked by the support you get from the many friends you will make. It is a village, of course. And it's a supportive village, and that in itself is cheering.
And I would just add that despite everything we hear about our MPs, and you know, everyone still thinks that we have this ghastly class of politicians. The overwhelming majority of the politicians that I have dealt with over the years have also been friendly, courteous, helpful, interesting, and I know that defies the caricature that everyone has, especially at the moment. But that was my experience in over 20 years working at Westminster, and I still cover a lot of politics, and I still talk to a lot of the people that I talked to when I was working more directly at Westminster.
Hilly, over to you.
Well, I think actually we're just coming up to the end there. So unless anybody's got a last minute question to put in the chat, I think it's probably time to say thank you very much to both of you. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've been teaching young journalism students today all about the lobby and who influences, how proprietors influence journalists or don't influence them, and the kind of constraints and pressures on journalists, which are even greater now, I think, than ever. But we've got some great events coming up. We've got Charlene White, the ITV news presenter and broadcaster, on November the 23rd at 7. That'll be online as well, so you're very welcome to join us. And we're also running an event which is all about writing sensitively about violence against women, which has obviously been a very hot topic over the last few months, really. So I think it just remains to say goodbye and thank you very much, and do everybody who's here buy Carole's book and enjoy it very much. Thank you, and thank you very much, Julia, for the interview.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Carole, for such a difficult hour, but not a difficult hour, but a lot of talking you've had to do, and you've covered the ground brilliantly. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Julia. It's great to talk to you, and a huge thank you as well to Hilly for organising this, and well done for Women in Journalism. And yeah, I hope people will just read and enjoy the book. And I've tried, one of the things I set out to do was just to try and make it something that would be interesting for anyone who's interested at all in our political life. So I just hope people will enjoy it, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.